Have you ever caught yourself in like a tricky situation and thought, man, what would, I don't know, like Socrates or somebody say about this?
Yeah, totally.
Well, on today's deep dive, we're kind of doing that, like using that as a jumping off point to really explore these sources we have, and specifically an article by Patricia A. Alexander called What Would Dewey Say? Channeling Dewey on the issue of specificity of epistemic beliefs, a response to Muse, Bendixson, and Harrell, 2006.
Right, so almost like a thought experiment, you
Mm,
know? Like, what would this really smart person from the past think about this problem we're looking at?
exactly.
She's like a journey,
Yeah.
an intellectual journey. And in this case, with the insights of the philosopher John Dewey as our guide.
Or compass, so to speak.
Yeah, compass.
Perfect.
And our mission on this deep dive is to explore what are called epistemic beliefs. And basically, that's just what you believe about knowledge itself.
About knowing. Yeah.
Right, and how we come to know
Yeah.
things. And we're going to trace how this concept has evolved from its philosophical roots to its study in psychology and its application in education. So it's all connected.
Yeah.
And the central question we're tackling is whether your beliefs about knowledge are the same across all subjects or if they change depending on what you're thinking about.
Like, is it the same if you're thinking about history or math?
Exactly, yeah. Like, is the trustworthiness of a historical account judged the same way you would judge a mathematical proof?
That's a good question, yeah.
And speaking of guides for this journey, who better than John Dewey? He was this huge figure who really shaped both philosophy and the early field of psychology. Plus, he was so passionate about education.
Yeah.
And I think it's so insightful that Alexander chose to focus on Dewey in her article, especially because the article that she's responding to by Muse and his colleagues in 2006 also tries to connect these three areas: philosophy, psychology, and education.
So it's all coming together.
Yeah.
All right, so where do we even start with something this big?
Well, Alexander's article gives us some great starting points, these three key questions.
Okay, so like our guideposts for this deep dive.
Yeah, exactly. First, what happens when the study of epistemology moves from philosophy into the realms of psychology and education? Like, what do we gain and what might we lose in that transition?
Okay, so the gains and losses, that's a good way to think about it.
Second, is the big question really about whether students' beliefs about knowledge are different depending on the subject? Or should we be focusing more on why those beliefs might vary?
So the if or the why, that makes sense.
Exactly. And third, what does all of this mean for teaching and learning? Like, what are the practical implications of whether these beliefs are kind of broad and general or really specific to certain topics?
Those are some big questions.
Yeah, but good ones to guide us.
Totally.
So to start off, how about we dive into that first question?
Yeah.
What happens when we take epistemology out of philosophy and bring it into these new areas?
Yeah, sounds good. So right away, Alexander argues that while it's obviously valuable to bring the study of knowledge epistemology into psychology and education,
Sure.
this shift, it isn't without its downside.
Right. There are trade-offs.
Exactly. And especially when it comes to keeping our ideas and definitions clear and well-defined.
Focused.
Yes, focus.
And that's where I think this idea of conceptual clarity comes in.
I like that.
Yeah. Alexander's point is that when researchers, let's say in education, when they're trying to understand how general and subject-specific epistemic beliefs actually work and develop, which, is something that the Tide model by Muse and his colleagues tries to map out.
Right. Looking at how these beliefs change over time.
Exactly. And it gets complicated because they're basically dealing with a ton of different concepts at the same time. So you have these beliefs about what knowledge even is, the difference between beliefs that apply to everything versus those that are specific to, say, science or literature, and you're trying to understand it from the point of view of a single student all the way up to the level of a whole school or even society as a whole.
Wow, that's a lot to juggle.
It is. And on top of that, you're pulling in ideas from philosophy, psychology, and education, which each have their own ways of talking about these things.
So it's like trying to solve 3 jigsaw puzzles at the same time using all the pieces from all 3 boxes.
That's a great way to put it. And Alexander actually uses this helpful analogy from statistics.
Okay.
It's this idea of degrees of freedom. She's saying that the more factors you're trying to take into account when you're looking at what students believe about knowledge and how those beliefs change, the more likely it is that things will get messy, that errors will kind of creep into how we understand things.
So it's like the more variables you add, the more difficult it is to really pinpoint what's going on.
Exactly. And that's something for you to think about too. Because when you hear Terms like knowing or understanding in different contexts, whether it's a scientific report or a historical account, the assumptions about what counts as knowledge in each of those areas might be completely different.
Yeah, so the word knowing doesn't always mean the same thing in different situations.
Right. And this leads to another challenge that Alexander calls conceptual translation.
Oh, okay. What's that?
So how can we be absolutely sure that when we use a word like epistemology, it means the exact same thing, whether it's being discussed in a philosophy class, a psychology lab, or a teacher training?
Yeah, that's tricky, right?
Yeah, there's this danger that the meaning subtly shifts as it crosses those boundaries between disciplines. It's like the word theory.
Oh, yeah, good example.
If I just say theory in casual conversation, it doesn't mean the same thing as when a scientist says theory.
Right, like a scientific theory has to be based on tons of evidence and testing. It's not just a random guess.
Exactly, and I think it's similar with epistemology. Because in philosophy, epistemology is about the fundamental study of what it means to really know something.
Hmm.
And crucially, how we justify our claims to knowledge. It's not so much about what individual people believe about knowledge. It's more like the study of knowledge itself.
The study of knowing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not just what someone thinks they know, it's about how we know anything at all.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
And Alexander points out that when psychologists study how people, whether it's kids or adults, think about knowledge, they're usually not studying their thoughts about the study of knowledge itself.
It's kind of a meta thing, right? Like thinking about knowing.
Exactly. It can get really meta. But psychologists are more interested in what knowledge is to that person
Mm.
and how they think they come to know things.
Right, more like their personal understanding of knowledge.
And this is where this idea of personal epistemology comes in. It was an attempt by Hoffer and Pintrich to define this psychological perspective on beliefs about knowledge.
Okay.
But even that term can still imply that we're studying beliefs about epistemology, which isn't really the goal.
It's like we need a new word entirely.
Right, like a word that specifically means beliefs about knowledge, but not about the study of knowledge.
Yeah.
That's why Alexander and her colleagues often prefer terms like epistemic beliefs or epistemic cognition, because it's more directly about the beliefs we hold that are related to knowledge, not about the field of study itself.
Okay, I see the distinction, yeah.
But here's the thing. Dewey, with his very practical and down-to-earth approach, might actually question whether getting hung up on finding the perfect word is the most important thing here.
So Dewey's like, let's not get bogged down in semantics.
Yeah, exactly. He believed that the meaning of a term comes from how it's actually used within a specific community or group of people. So this ambition of Muse and his colleagues to establish this really specific and universal language for epistemic beliefs might seem a little less important from Dewey's perspective.
Yeah, especially in a field that's relatively new, there's bound to be some evolution in the language as the field matures.
Exactly. It's
Are-
an ongoing process.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the potential downsides, like the loss of conceptual clarity when we move epistemology out of its philosophical home and into psychology and education.
Right.
But Alexander also points out some really important gains. For one thing, the review by Muse and his colleagues gives us a really good overview of where psychology research on epistemic beliefs stands right now. It shows us what's been studied, where there's agreement, and where there's still debate.
Yeah, it's like taking stock of the field.
Exactly.
And the review might even suggest that research on epistemic beliefs has naturally progressed from looking at general beliefs about knowledge towards more subject-specific ones. It makes sense in a way, right? Like you start broad, and then as you learn more, you start to zoom in on the specifics.
Yeah, so maybe the big question isn't so much about whether beliefs are inherently general or specific, but about how our understanding of them has become more detailed over time.
I think that's a really good point.
And as our understanding evolves, the language we use to talk about them will also change, right? It has to, in order to accurately reflect what we're learning.
Definitely.
I was thinking about some of my own research, too, and how we've had to really carefully consider whether the questions we're asking are truly about epistemology in the philosophical sense, or more about understanding people's personal beliefs about knowledge. It can be tricky sometimes.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think that kind of reflection is important.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to that idea of conceptual focus. Alexander points out that the review by Muse and his colleagues, maybe unintentionally, highlights where psychological research has really concentrated its efforts and where there might be some gaps.
Okay, I'm interested to hear about this.
So it seems like a lot of research has been focused on understanding students' beliefs about whether knowledge is simple or complex. and whether it's certain and unchanging, or if it can change over time. Those are like the biggies.
Makes sense. Those are pretty fundamental questions.
Right, like, is there one right answer, or are there many different perspectives?
Exactly.
But Alexander points out that one area that's gotten less attention is the justification of knowledge, which is a central idea in philosophy. It's about how we actually know what we know, like what counts as good evidence and reasoning.
Right. So it's not just believing something, it's understanding why we believe it.
Exactly, and I think that distinction is super important. Like, you can believe something is true, but if you can't explain why it's considered true in, say, a scientific or historical context, then your understanding is incomplete.
Yeah. And that's where things like argumentation, classroom discussions, and evidence-based reasoning come in.
Hmm.
These are areas of research that touch on justification, but it hasn't been the main focus in psychological studies of epistemic beliefs.
Right, and Alexander suggests that exploring justification more deeply could be really insightful because different subjects might have different standards for what counts as good evidence or a valid reason to believe something. Like, how you would justify a historical claim is probably different from how you would justify mathematical proof.
For sure, the evidence you would use is different, and the way you present your argument would likely be different too. And another thing Alexander observes is that psychological research sometimes seems to focus more on what students or teachers perceive knowledge to be, like its basic nature and form. And that leans more towards ontology, which is the study of what is, rather than epistemology, which is about what is known.
Oh, okay, I see the difference.
Yeah, so it's like ontology is about what actually exists, the facts of
Yeah.
the matter, while epistemology is about how we come to know those facts and why we trust them as being true.
I like that distinction. It's helpful. And this potential confusion between ontology and epistemology in research is something that other scholars like Karen Murphy and Jeffrey Green have pointed out too.
Right.
And Alexander uses this really clear analogy to illustrate it.
Oh, yeah. What is it?
She compares it to reliability and validity in educational measurement. So you can have data that is really consistent, like you get the same results every time you measure something. But if it's not valid, meaning if you're not actually measuring what you think you're measuring,
Right.
then your findings are meaningless.
It's like if you have a scale that always says you weigh 150 pounds, but you actually weigh 160. The scale is reliable, it's giving you a consistent measurement, but it's not valid, it's not accurate.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that analogy applies really well here. Like, if we're not clear about whether we're studying ontology or epistemology, then our research might not actually be telling us what we think it is.
Right, so it's all about being really precise and careful in how we define our research questions.
Totally.
And Alexander's careful to point out that she's not saying that philosophy is superior to psychology in this regard. That would actually go against Dewey's own thinking.
Oh, how so?
Well, Dewey was really skeptical of philosophers who were searching for these absolute unchanging truths. He was much more interested in how beliefs actually work in real-life situations and how they lead to practical outcomes.
Okay, so Dewey was more focused on the application of beliefs, not just abstract theories.
Exactly. And Alexander's main point is that we need to be mindful of those distinctions that philosophy makes and be clear about our own intentions when we choose to kind of blur those lines in psychological research.
So it's not about saying one approach is better, it's about being aware of the different perspectives and being transparent about our choices.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary.
Okay, so that gives us a pretty good understanding of the gains and losses when epistemology moves from philosophy into psychology and education. Now, what about that second big question, the one about if versus why?
Yeah, let's get into that.
So in their review, Muse and his colleagues took a very logical approach to trying to determine whether epistemic beliefs tend to be general, like applying across all subjects, or specific to particular domains.
Right, the big debate, whether beliefs are general or domain-specific.
Exactly. And Alexander points out that the model they ended up proposing, while interesting, seemed to reflect more of a sociocultural perspective, which is this idea that our beliefs are shaped by the social and cultural context we're in.
Right, so it's less about the logic of knowledge itself and more about how our environment and experiences influence what we believe about knowledge.
And she saw this as a bit of a disconnect. Like, they started with this very logical analysis, but ended up with a model that was more about social influences.
It's interesting, right? Like, their thinking evolved as they explored the research.
Yeah, and she even suggests that Dewey, with his emphasis on the practical and the experiential, might actually appreciate that shift towards the doing aspect of beliefs.
Okay, see that.
And this is where she includes this great quote from Dewey. Everything the teacher does, as well as the manner in which he does it, incites the child to respond in some way or other, and each response tends to set the child's attitude in some way or other. And this quote, it really highlights how much influence the educational environment has on shaping a child's developing beliefs.
Yeah, so it's not just what's being explicitly taught, it's the entire learning environment that's shaping these beliefs.
Exactly, and this leads to the central question in this section of Alexander's article. If we acknowledge that these sociocultural factors play such a big role,
Hmm.
then why aren't we applying that same logic to the question of whether epistemic beliefs are general or domain specific?
So instead of asking if they're different across domains,
Yeah.
we should be asking why they might be different.
Yes, and she raises some really thought-provoking questions about whether the nature of knowledge, its sources, and how we justify it are treated the same way across different educational contexts. Like, do teachers use the same kinds of evidence when they're teaching English versus history? Is the expectation for justifying your ideas the same in elementary school as it is in high school?
Yeah, that's a great point. And Alexander points out, based on her own research and the work of others, that teachers, the materials they use, and their actual teaching practices can vary drastically from one subject to another.
And that observation is actually echoed in the review by Muse and his colleagues, so they're on the same page there. But then the question becomes, how can we realistically expect students to develop these general beliefs about knowledge when they're constantly being exposed to these domain-specific differences?
Right, like how can their beliefs remain unaffected by these influences?
Yeah, and Alexander wonders what would enable students to look beyond things like the emphasis on speed and getting the right answer that's so common in some classrooms, or the way certain subjects like math are presented as being so absolute and certain, or how multiple choice tests often simplify complex issues down to a single correct answer.
So she's saying that the educational environment itself might be pushing students towards more domain-specific beliefs.
Yeah, I think that's part of her argument.
And to further emphasize this point, Alexander includes another insightful quote from Dewey. This one's about how rote learning, just memorizing facts and procedures without really understanding them, can actually hinder the development of students' critical thinking skills, their ability to really reflect on what they're learning.
So Dewey's saying that just going through the motions without deeper understanding isn't enough.
Exactly.
So ultimately, instead of getting stuck on this either question of whether epistemic beliefs are general or domain specific, Alexander proposes that we might need a more nuanced approach, one that acknowledges the possibility of both general and specific beliefs existing and interacting with each other.
I like that. It's a more flexible view.
Yeah, and she suggests that the real focus should be on understanding how these beliefs develop and are shaped by students' individual experiences and the specific context in which they learn.
Right? So it's about acknowledging the complexity and the individual variation.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all answer here.
That makes perfect sense.
Okay, so we've talked about conceptual clarity. We've discussed the if versus why of domain-specific beliefs. And now we're at that final guiding question.
Hmm.
What are the practical implications of all of this for teaching and learning?
Yeah, let's bring it back to the classroom.
So Alexander sets the stage for this section by quoting Dewey on the importance of imagination in scientific progress, which I thought was really interesting.
Oh, I like that connection.
Yeah, and she stresses that the psychological study of epistemic beliefs is still relatively new and that it needs careful nurturing with well-defined concepts and principles to help it mature effectively.
It's like any new field. It needs a solid foundation to build on.
Mm-hmm.
But she also gives credit to researchers like Mies and his colleagues for pushing the boundaries of what we know about epistemic beliefs and trying to capture their complexity.
Yeah, their review, while maybe not perfect, has definitely sparked a lot of important conversations and new research directions.
And that's crucial, right? They kind of pushing the boundaries is what moves a field forward.
Exactly. And she specifically praises their willingness to explore how epistemic beliefs connect to other aspects of learning, like cognitive factors and motivation.
Because learning isn't just about what you know. It's also about how you think and how motivated you are to learn.
Right. And research like this has the potential to reveal some really powerful insights into how our experiences, both inside and outside of school, shape our fundamental understanding of what knowledge is and how it works, and in turn, how our beliefs about knowledge ultimately influence our learning outcomes.
So it's all connected. Our experiences shape our beliefs, and our beliefs shape our learning.
It's a dynamic system.
And even though Alexander doesn't get into a detailed critique of the specific model proposed by Muse and his colleagues, She commends them for putting their ideas out there for discussion and debate,
Mm.
for contributing to the ongoing conversation about epistemic beliefs.
And I think that's a great attitude to have, this willingness to share your ideas and be open to feedback and revision.
Definitely, that's how progress happens.
All right, so as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some of the big takeaways for our listeners?
Great question.
Well, we've explored Alexander's response to the review by Muse and his colleagues, really focusing on those three key questions she raises. And we've done this through the lens of John Dewey's ideas, which has added this really interesting layer to the conversation.
Yeah, Dewey's emphasis on the practical and the experiential really helps to ground these sometimes abstract concepts.
Totally. And we've talked about the potential trade-offs that happen when we bring philosophical concepts into psychology and education, especially that challenge of maintaining conceptual clarity and focus.
Right, and how language can be tricky when we're dealing with ideas from different fields.
hmm And we've also considered whether the big question is really about the existence of domain-specific beliefs or about understanding why those beliefs might develop.
And how the educational environment itself can play a significant role in shaping those beliefs.
Exactly.
So for you, our listeners, we want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. How might your own beliefs about knowledge and knowing actually differ across the different areas of your life or work?
Ooh, good one.
Yeah, like what kinds of evidence do you personally find most convincing when you're making a decision at work versus when you're having a discussion about politics with friends?
What makes you go, okay, I believe this, this is true?
Exactly. And how does the way knowledge is presented or valued in different contexts influence your own understanding and acceptance of it?
It's really about that interplay between your general beliefs about knowledge and the very specific ways that knowledge works in the different domains of your life.
Yeah, because knowledge isn't this static thing. It's constantly being shaped and reshaped by our experiences and the context in which we encounter it.
It's a lifelong journey of learning and questioning and refining our understanding.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive as we explored these fascinating ideas about knowledge and learning. And we're already looking forward to our next exploration into the ever-evolving world of how we know what we know.